Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. Nietzsche exclaimed in 1882 that God is dead. Now, he wasn't celebrating this fact. He was actually quite disheartened by it. And he was critical of, every philosophy, really. Christianity and even the Stoics. And though I find him in the final analysis maybe wrong or misled about a lot of things, I think he was right for sure about one thing, and that's the death of God as an idea, as a construct, would send humanity into a massive conundrum. Essentially, is life worth living? Now, this episode is going to get into some really deep and dark topics, so prepare thyself. It is a bit of a heavy one. As always, I try and end with a little bit of light. This podcast is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network, which is essentially a bunch of podcasts of similar tone, similar philosophical thought and depth. Consider checking out the Walled Garden to learn more. The Walled Garden Philosophical Society, it's a global community. We're building something big. I'm a founding member, I'm a director, contributor, mentor, and of course, a philosopher, because we all have a very, very noble and important mission. And the people that are getting involved are top tier, and I'm very excited to be working with these people. Consider checking out the meetups every Thursday, where we talk about various topics. There's generally one speaker that's selected from our society, and they talk about a certain matter, and we have a discussion afterwards and Q&A. So consider joining that. They're free. You just have to go register to be part of the discussion. Also consider checking out my Patreon, which will be still active. Just if you want to support me and say thank you for the content, you can do it there. My coaching services are going to be moved to go directly through the Walled Garden at some point. So if you do want coaching, check that out. Check me out on Telegram, where you can join in on the discussion of the podcast episodes. That's the Strong Stoic channel and the Strong Stoic channel chat. Finally, you can check out my articles on Medium and at the Stoic Gym. Let's have a brief look at the history of religion. Tremendously oversimplified. So if you're a history buff when it comes to religion, you're going to be very disheartened about my summary here. But for a very, very long time, humanity was religious. We're still religious, fundamentally. But what I mean by that is we believed in something like a god, right? It wasn't always belief in the Abrahamic God. Early hunter-gatherer societies worshipped something like a lord of the wild beasts, right? Which essentially points to the hunt as the main food source and driving force of culture. So they had this sort of like a god, right? But more of like a lord of the hunt, something like that. The Egyptians came in, and the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and they all believed in a divine god. They believed in something bigger than themselves. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was the connection between God and man, and Marduk, of course, was the Babylonian god, which I've spoken about before. Stoicism is about 2,500 years old, and they were actually a lot more religious than people think. I mean, check out Traditional Stoicism by Chris Fisher. Stoicism on Fire is his podcast, and you'll know soon enough that Stoics, the ancient Stoics, were very, very religious. In fact, I would argue that you can't be a Stoic unless you are religious to some degree. And again, I don't mean organized religion, but I mean religious. Finding something of value, finding something that's bigger than yourself. Now, the whole idea of providence and a belief in the cosmos or the cosmic plan, I mean, that's enough to be religious, right? I mean, those are Stoic ideas that you can't help but believe in if you want to practice Stoicism, because it's the fundamental ethos behind accepting things as they come to you. Part of that is accepting that it's not that you don't have any free will, but it's that there is this sort of plan. The cosmos is kind of pushing you in different directions, and you get to decide how you fall or how you move or how you react. But it's also noteworthy to note that the Stoics often bring up Zeus and the Greek gods as well. Now, Judaism, Christianity, of course, they came into the picture. Judaism about 2,500 years ago, Christianity about 2,000 years ago or so, and then later Islam came in. And these are all really come from the same quote-unquote Abrahamic God. For a long time, the Abrahamic God in one of these forms dominated the world. In fact, the Abrahamic God still dominates the world. I mean, look at how many Jews there are and Christians and Muslims. Makes up a very large proportion of religious belief. But these are all Abrahamic religions that are built upon each other. I know that there's some bad blood between these groups, but fundamentally, they're very similar. They have way more overlap than differences. Now, along this time, human history, of course, there's scientific discoveries, but it was far from the rigorous scientific method that we have today. Of course, you would certainly argue that, and you could certainly argue, that both religion and science aim to understand the world around us, and maybe the differences is in the methods that they use, hence the scientific method. But to put things into perspective, Galileo declared the Earth round at around 1600. It's not that long ago. You're talking 400 years ago. Newton, who really built physics as it is today, that was about 100 years later, so about 1700 or 300 years ago. I mean, it's not that long ago. And since then, there's been a rapid growth in science. And I'm going to get some hate for saying this, but there's actually a connection between Christianity and science. Remember that these philosophies, and really it's the foundation that is Stoicism in and of itself, they're built upon this idea of logos. And logos means, logic, reason, seeking truth, discussion, dialogue. It means all these things. You could very well say that Stoicism and Christianity believe truth to be the antidote to tyranny and suffering. That is, speak truth. Let's discuss this. Let's have dialogue. Let's figure out what the truth is, and maybe the truth will save us. Maybe that truth is something that we need to know for survival. I mean, Christ speaks truth, and that's how he brings good into being. And it's quite a simple idea. If there's a hole in my backyard that I could fall into and die, I want to know about that hole because I don't want to fall into it and die. I mean, that's the simple ethos behind why we value truth. In fact, Nietzsche believed that this idea of logos, of speaking truth, of dialogue, of logic, of reason, was so prominent in Christianity that it led to its own destruction. Now that is because the Christians were so dedicated to truth, it came to be that humanity ended up killing the Christian God, in a sense, through science. Essentially the theory of evolution by Charles Darwin, which provided a much more rational theory of creation, at least up until this point, than Christianity and other religions. And that leads us to the mess that we're in. You see, we're currently at the time in history, if you were to look back, let's say fast forward 1,000 years from now, you look back, I don't know what we're going to be doing in 1,000 years, but I do know that when they look back on this time period, they're going to be looking at how the hell people could possibly come to terms with the fact that God is dead. We're trying to make sense of it. Like, what does that mean? What does that really mean? God is dead. This is very recent. I mean, most people before the 1800s, even before the 1900s, even during the 1900s, before the 2000s, most people had a very strong belief in God. And still, I think the majority of people on earth still believe in a God. But this podcast is catered towards people in the West where we have this idea that God is dead, generally speaking. Now, this is very recent, very, very recent. And I don't judge anyone from believing in a God. I'll get to that later. But overall, we can see that human beings have desired to understand the world around us, the universe around us, the cosmos. And through that, we figured out that, speaking truth is probably a good idea, because if we speak truth, we can learn more, we can figure out what's going on around us, and maybe that can save us. Maybe that can be our salvation. But eventually what that led us to was the fact that, as Nietzsche declared in The Gay Science, God is dead. And this entirely disrupted the foundation of our psychology and our society. Now remember, our psychology and our society are both built upon this idea in many ways, that there is a God, that there's something bigger than us. Moral psychologist Jonathan Haidt believes that this idea, this God, evolved within us because we work together as a community, as a tribe, which makes us feel like we're part of the hive, similar to bees. Bees will sacrifice themselves for the hive. And Jonathan Haidt believes that we have just a little bit of that in our psychology, and that's why we feel like there's something bigger than us. It's because when we come together as a group, as a community, there is something bigger than us, and that is the community. That's lineage, as the biologists would say. But in any case, we have a psychology that really depends on that belief, that there's something important, that we need meaning. A lion doesn't need meaning. A lion just goes out there and eats and sleeps, lives the dream. But human beings need a meaning. Our psychology requires that. And the proof of that, one ways of looking at that is you look at how the least traditionally religious countries suffer from the most oppression right now. Look at the U.S. Depression is skyrocketing. People have no meaning. Anxiety is through the roof. There's all kinds of these weird psychological disorders. And I don't mean weird in a bad way. I just mean we haven't had that quantity as a species before. We never had depression like we have. A large part of that anxiety, perhaps all of that anxiety in the final analysis, is something like existential anxiety, existential angst. And now we're left with the current mess. What the hell do we do? We've declared God is dead. We've deemed many religions as unscientific and that we should get rid of them. And yet, we're suffering massively because of this. Truth used to be universally useful to us. But is it right now? Is truth still the best thing right now? And this is where we are as a species. We're trying to figure out how to live with our old psychological baggage while staring the truth in the face that God is dead. We know from chemistry now that even the protons, the electrons, the neutrons, the smallest, not the smallest, but one of the smallest things that we understand today, that's going to break down eventually. The universe as we know it, the cosmos as we know it, will die eventually. Nietzsche said, and I quote, "To what extent can truth be incorporated? That is the question. That is the experiment." And we are currently running that experiment. We've chased truth for all of our human history, and it's led us to a truth that maybe we wish we wouldn't have discovered in the first place. Is truth still universally good? Should we still move towards that? Or have we gone too far? It kind of reminds me of the dwarves in The Lord of the Rings. Forgive me, I can't help but throw in a nerdy reference, but essentially dwarves were just miners, so they were digging underground, and they dug up something. They dug just a little bit too deep in their greed. And they ended up waking up a very, very old sleeping evil, Balrog. And once that evil was awake, well, it's awake. It's here to wreak havoc. And it really begs the question, have we dug too deep into truth? Have we uncovered truths that maybe we'd be better off not knowing? Well, to have maybe some hope, there is always the chance that truth will ultimately set us free. There's certainly scientific discussions going on now asking if we're in a simulation right now. And if we are in a simulation right now, some very smart people think we are, well, someone had to make that simulation, and maybe that person is God. So maybe there is a God. Maybe there's not an afterlife, but maybe there's a God. Perhaps at the end of the day, truth will ultimately end up setting us free. Or not. Maybe instead we're better off valuing untruth at this point. Maybe we're better off brainwashing ourselves into untrue beliefs. It's a bit of a weird, dark thing to even contemplate, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't get much darker than this. This is where we are. This is our current conundrum. Many modern people today look at people who are still into traditional religions, and they look at them as unscientific, as hocus pocus, right? I mean, look at that. These are crazy people. But let's say they are unscientific, and let's say that they are ignorant of the truth, at least this particular truth. If they live happier, if they live more meaningful lives, can you honestly say that you are better off if you're currently in depression and living meaninglessly? It's a real question. Like, would you rather suffer from depression in the 21st century, knowing that God is dead, knowing that in 100 billion, 100 trillion years, everything you know is not going to exist, the universe is going to not even be what you see it as being right now. There's an end date to everything, not just your life, but humanity as a whole. Or would you rather have genuine faith and believe in a God and an afterlife in the 18th century and live your life like that? It's a real question. Are some truths better off not knowing? I had Dr. Jeremy Sherman on the podcast a while ago now. And he said that you have to move towards truth and away from truth at your peril. So are there some truths that are maybe not worth knowing for your own good? Now, these are some really, really deep and dark philosophical questions, isn't it? Because, I mean, I think it was Albert Camus that said the only true question of philosophy is that of suicide, which is really that of nihilism. It's like, is there any meaning to this? Is life worth living? Should we stay here? Should we try and figure this out? And I hope it's clear, because I know I've been a little dark and gloomy. I hope it's clear that I personally really think that life is beautiful and worth living. But again, we're all in an experiment right now. I'm one individual with one subjective experience with a very particular personality. I mean, that's just me. As a society, though, we're running this experiment right now. What do we do when God is dead? I can tell you what works for me. I can tell you how I think about this in the face of what we now know to be truth. Stoicism does seem to provide that meaning. Not just Stoicism, existentialism as well, and many other elements of philosophies, but let me sum this up, at least. Maybe we'll even remove the tag of Stoicism. Let me sum up what keeps me going. Sure, yes, eventually the universe as we know it will fall apart. But not today. Yes, at some point in the future, the last human being will die. But not today. Open your eyes, look around, look at the beautiful trees, look at the positive elements of human nature, the love, the connection, smell the flowers, feel the steel of the barbell pinching your hands when you squat. Take pleasure in love and connection between people you care about and the good of mankind and virtue. recognize that all of that can be summed up as nature is beautiful. Human nature, your personal nature, Mother Nature. It's all beautiful. Life is beautiful. It's such a privilege to be here right now. Such a privilege to experience what you're experiencing. And the chances of you being here right now are so astronomically slim. It's literally a miracle. Literally a miracle that you're here right now and that you get to experience this, that you get to wake up early and be tired in the morning, that you get to work all day, that you get to have people you care about, to talk with people, to have connections, to sit down and read a book, to smile, to laugh, to cry. It's a miracle. It's a privilege. It's such a privilege. And all of your ancestors worked so hard to get you right here. And you've had a lot of ancestors. Life can be beautiful. And I realize it's not beautiful for everyone. Some people have been given a bad hand. Some people are born into countries that don't have social systems. Some people are born into war and die very young. So maybe the meaning of life isn't to be good so that there's an afterlife for you once you die, but maybe it's to be a good, virtuous person so that together we can all create a world where as many people as possible get to experience a truly wonderful life, where as many people as possible can at least have the opportunity to recognize that nature, in all of its forms, your personal nature, human nature, Mother Nature, is beautiful. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to support me, consider leaving a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. If you're new here, episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Check out my Instagram, Twitter. I'm on all the social medias. YouTube's as well. Not going to bug you anymore. Thanks again. Cheers. Until next time.